Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Last summer started great. The plants in my garden were loaded with more tomatoes than I'd ever grown. But then something strange happened. I go outside to check on them and notice one or two missing. At first, I thought it was probably an animal. We had rabbits around, maybe a raccoon. I put up chicken wire and adjusted the fencing, but tomatoes kept disappearing. It was driving me crazy. I'd count them in the morning, and by evening, the count would be off. Not many, just enough to notice. Just enough to annoy me. One afternoon, I was sitting in my living room with a magazine trying to relax. The window was open because of the heat, and I heard rustling from the side yard. It wasn't the usual wind through the leaves. This sounded different, more deliberate. I got up and looked through the blinds. There she was, Karen, my neighbor from 3 houses down. She was standing right in the middle of my garden, picking tomatoes off my plants like she was at a store. I ran outside and asked what she was doing. She didn't even look surprised, just looked at me like I'd interrupted her shopping. She told me to relax, that they were just tomatoes and I had plenty. I explained that wasn't the point. This was my garden, and she couldn't just take whatever she wanted. She rolled her eyes and called me stingy. She said it wasn't like I didn't have enough to spare, pointing at all the plants. My face got hot. I wasn't angry about the tomatoes themselves. I worked hard on them, sure, but it was about respect. I told her it wasn't about being stingy. She didn't ask permission. She was on my property, taking my things without asking. That was stealing. Karen laughed, not a friendly laugh either. More like she found the whole thing ridiculous. She said I was being dramatic over some vegetables. Then she added that if anyone asked, she'd tell them I gave the tomatoes to her. She wanted to know who I thought people would believe. That really got to me. She was threatening to lie about it, counting on her reputation in the neighborhood to back her up. Karen had lived here longer than I had, knew more people. She probably figured she could spin any story she wanted. She walked off with 4 of my best tomatoes, and I just stood there, too angry to speak. But when I watched her go, I made a decision. This wasn't going to keep happening. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought 2 security cameras. Nothing fancy, just basic ones that would record to my computer. I spent the afternoon setting them up around the garden, making sure they had a clear view of the tomato plants. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, around the same time, the motion sensors triggered. I pulled up the feed on my laptop and watched in real time when Karen came through the side gate, looked around like she was checking if anyone was watching, and then started picking tomatoes. I saved the footage and called the police. The dispatcher seemed confused at first when I explained what was happening, but she sent someone over. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. I showed them the video. I could see them trying not to smile when they watched Karen sneaking around my garden. One of them asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. I'd asked her to stop and she wouldn't listen. The other officer nodded and said they'd go talk to her. I followed them down the street, keeping back a bit. I wanted to see this. They knocked on her door, and when Karen answered, her whole face changed when she saw the police. The first officer told her they needed to talk about my garden. Karen said she didn't know what they were talking about. The second officer explained they had video footage of her taking tomatoes from my property without permission. Karen's eyes went wide, then narrowed. She pointed at me, standing behind the officers, and said that I'd given them to her. She said I told her she could have them whenever she wanted. I pulled out my phone and held it up so she could see the screen. I asked her why she was sneaking around if that was true. I also reminded her that 2 days ago she told me she'd lie and say I gave them to her. The officer asked to see the footage. I showed them. Karen watched, and I could see the exact moment she realized she was caught. Her face went from angry to pale. Karen said this was ridiculous. She couldn't believe I was calling the police over a few tomatoes. The first officer told her it was trespassing and theft. The value didn't change what it was. Karen said it was insane and that I was being petty. The second officer told her that she needed to come with them to the station. Karen asked if they were serious, but they were serious. They handcuffed her right there on her front porch. Some of the neighbors had come out to see what was happening. I saw curtains moving in windows up and down the street. By the next morning, everyone knew about it. Karen's husband showed up at my door 3 days later. He looked exhausted. He apologized for what Karen did. He explained that she gets these ideas in her head sometimes and doesn't think about how it affects other people. I told him I appreciated that. I just wanted it to stop. He promised it would and said he'd replace what she took. He brought over a bag of tomatoes from the store the next day. It was a nice gesture, even though they weren't as good as the ones from my garden. The court date was about a month later. It was quick. The judge watched the video, heard both sides, and found Karen guilty of petty theft and trespassing. She got a fine and 40 hours of community service. She also had to stay off my property. After that, things got quiet. Karen stopped her morning power walks where she'd inspect everyone's yards like she owned the place. She stopped hosting her loud weekend barbecues where she'd invite everyone on the street except the people she was currently annoyed with. A few weeks into her community service, she came to my door. She told me she wanted to apologize. She said what she did was wrong. She didn't make eye contact, and it was obvious she didn't want to be there, but she said it. I thanked her and told her I accepted her apology. That was it. She left, and we've barely spoken since. But she hasn't set foot in my garden again either. My tomatoes are doing even better this year. I added some peppers and a small apple tree in the back corner. And yes, I still share produce with my neighbors. The ones who knock on my door and ask nicely always leave with something. The cameras are still up though, just in case. I was 9 when my parents separated, 10 when they divorced. My dad forced my mom to sell our childhood home, the only place I'd ever known, and moved straight in with his girlfriend and her 3 kids. Main custody went to my mom, but every other weekend and every other holiday, my younger sister and I had to pack our bags and go stay with him. My sister was only 5 then. She adapted easily, loved the new stepfamily, played with the stepkids like they'd always been friends. But I couldn't. Maybe it was because I was older, more aware of what we'd lost. Maybe it was the undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome that made social situations harder for me. Whatever the reason, the stepkids decided they didn't like me. The bullying started small. Whispered insults when the adults were in looking, shoving me when we passed in the hallway, taking my things and hiding them. My sister, desperate to fit in with her new family, joined them. She was 7 and wanted to belong somewhere, even if it meant turning on me. Within 6 months, it escalated. They'd gang up on me, corner me in rooms, say horrible things. I tried calling my mom once, begging her to come get me. After that, my dad started taking my phone the moment he picked us up. No more calling for help. The stepmother defended them every single time. When I told her what they were doing, she'd look at me with cold eyes and tell me her kids denied it. She said I was lying for attention, that I was making things up to cause problems. I tried running away a few times that first year. My aunt lived less than a 40-minute walk away. My grandparents were about an hour and a half. I just wanted to get back to my real family. Then my dad and the stepmother moved over 2 hours away by car from where my mom lived. Running wasn't an option anymore. The only time I saw my dad at all during those weekends was at dinner, and those dinners were torture. He'd spend the entire meal talking about my mom, calling her a fat, greedy pig and worse things. My sister would laugh along with the stepkids. I'd sit there silently pushing food around my plate, counting the minutes until I could leave. When I was 12, maybe 13, I hit rock bottom. I was numb all the time, couldn't feel anything except this crushing weight. One day when the stepmother was telling me to get out of the house like she always did, I told her the truth. I said I wanted to die, that I didn't want to keep living like this anymore. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she shrugged and told me she didn't care. She said to get outside already, and if I was going to kill myself, to do it outside where she wouldn't have to deal with it. Not long after that, I broke down at school. Just started crying during class and couldn't stop for hours. Everything came pouring out to my teacher. The bullying, the isolation, the things my dad said about my mom, what the stepmother told me, everything. My school contacted Child Protective Services. They talked to me, ran tests, sent me to a psychologist. Eventually, they reached out to my dad with their concerns about my mental and emotional well being. His response was a phone call. He told me that since I felt the need to lie like that, I shouldn't come visit anymore. He said I should stay with my mom because he didn't care what happened to me. That was the last conversation we ever had. I heard about him through my sister over the years, but we never spoke again. 10 years later, my aunt called to tell me he died in a car accident. There was going to be a funeral. I decided to go, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe for closure, maybe just to see it for myself. The stepmother was there, obviously, widowed now. She had a son with my dad that I'd never met before. My half brother, he was around 8 years old. During the funeral and the wake afterward, she couldn't help herself. She insulted me, insulted my mom, insulted my dad's entire family. Then she started complaining loudly about finances. She went on about how his name was on everything they had together and asked how she was going to keep the house now. She kept saying that taxes alone were impossible and that she'd never worked a day in her life. So how was she supposed to manage everything? That's when it clicked. In my country, children of the deceased have a legal right to claim a minimum inheritance from their parents' estate if there's no will stating otherwise. The amount is substantial, around $115,000 each. Most people don't claim it right away when there's a surviving spouse. It's considered decent to wait until they pass too, or until they try to sell property. But legally, you can claim it anytime. I had no decency or pity for this woman. Neither did my sister anymore. By that point, she'd grown up and realized how toxic the stepfamily had been. I called her after the funeral. I told her I wanted to take the stepmother to court and claim our inheritance now. My sister was quiet for a moment, then said she was in and wanted to do it too. We hired a lawyer and filed the claim. My dad and the stepmother had owned some award-winning show dogs, the house and land, and a car. She'd also received insurance money and would get about 60% of what my dad would have earned monthly if he was still alive. If he'd left a will, she could have kept it all. He hadn't. The court case attracted attention. People muttered about how greedy we were, going after a widow's money. Strangers gave us disgusted looks, but we won. The house had to be sold, the dogs had to be sold, the car had to be sold, the insurance money got split. My sister got her share. I got mine. Our half-brother got his locked in a trust fund until he turned 18. We each received around $115,000. The stepmother was left with roughly $1,000 from the estate and her monthly survivor benefit of about $3,700. When the judge read the verdict, she exploded. She screamed that I should have killed myself when I had the chance. She yelled about how she was going to live now without a house. She shrieked about how dare I force her to sell her son's childhood home. She called me every vile name she could think of and kept screaming that I was destroying her life, that her precious boy would suffer because of me. The judge threatened her with contempt of court. Security had to escort her out while she was still shrieking obscenities. I walked out of that courthouse with my sister beside me. For the first time in over a decade, I felt something other than numbness. Not quite happiness, but something close to peace. She'd told me to kill myself outside her house rather than help a suicidal child. She'd defended her kids while they tortured me for years. She'd stood by while my dad cut me off for telling the truth. Now she knew what it felt like to lose everything. I've been dealing with asthma since I was about 11 years old. Nothing too dramatic, thankfully no emergency room visits or anything that serious, but it was enough to be a proper pain. The main issue was that I needed to sit down for about 10 minutes with my inhaler whenever my symptoms flared up. Otherwise, I'd end up having these really loud coughing fits that would disrupt whatever I was doing. The biggest trigger for me was temperature changes, especially going from cold into warm spaces. Coming inside during winter was the worst. And of course, physical activity made everything 10 times worse. Which brings me to the problem I had in year 9. I was on the rugby team at school, and like most schools in the UK, pretty much every physical education lesson became rugby training once you were on the team. We'd be out there in the cold, running drills, tackling, getting absolutely knackered. Then I'd have to rush straight to English class afterwards. This wasn't a problem during the warmer months, but when autumn turned to winter and the weather got properly cold, I started arriving to English about 10 minutes late. It wasn't because I was messing about or anything. I genuinely needed those 10 minutes to sit in the changing room, use my inhaler, and let my breathing settle down. If I didn't do this, I'd walk into English class and immediately start having a massive coughing fit that would last the entire lesson. After this happened twice, my English teacher decided he'd had enough. He pulled me aside after class one day and told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to stop being late to his lessons, or he'd start putting me in detention. I explained that it was because of my asthma and the cold weather. I told him I just needed a few minutes after physical education to use my inhaler and catch my breath. I said if I came straight to class without taking a break, I'd just end up coughing throughout the entire lesson. He said he didn't appreciate being lied to. He claimed he'd been teaching for 15 years and knew what smoking did to students. He actually accused me of sneaking off for cigarettes. I was absolutely gobsmacked. I told him I wasn't smoking and that I genuinely hated it. I explained that I'd just spent the last 6 months helping my mom quit and it had been horrible. I pulled out my inhaler from my pocket and showed it to him, hoping that would prove my point. He dismissed this completely. He said anyone could carry an inhaler around as a cover story. I even offered to let him smell my breath to prove I hadn't been smoking, but he wasn't having any of it. He then explained that he'd asked the class why I was late, and multiple students had shouted that I was smoking. He said I came in red-faced and wheezing, so it was pretty obvious what was going on. This was absolutely mental. There was this running joke at our school where anytime a teacher asked why someone was late, half the class would shout that they were smoking. It was meant to be funny, and I thought all the teachers knew it was just kids being idiots. Apparently, this teacher had taken it seriously. I tried to explain that it was just what the students said about everyone as a joke. I offered to get a note from my doctor if he needed proof about my asthma. He cut me off and said what he needed was for me to be on time to his lessons. No more excuses. I left that conversation absolutely fuming. I'd offered him evidence, I'd explained the situation, and he'd completely dismissed everything I said. So I decided that if he wanted me to be on time so badly, I'd be on time. The next physical education lesson, we had a brutal training session. It was freezing cold, and we'd been doing sprints and contact drills for the full hour. My chest was already feeling tight when I walked off the pitch. Normally, I'd have gone to the changing room, sat down, and used my inhaler until my breathing settled. Instead, I got changed quickly and headed straight to English. I walked into the classroom, still breathing heavily, and within about 30 seconds, I started coughing. Not just a little cough either, a proper, full-blown asthma attack. I was hunched over my desk, coughing so hard I could barely catch my breath between fits. Now, I'll admit that once I realized how disruptive it was, I may have played it up a bit. I was 14 and stubborn, and I wanted to prove my point. The teacher tried to continue with the lesson, but it was impossible. We were supposed to be reading through a book together, taking turns to read passages aloud. Usually, we'd manage a page or two per lesson. That day, we barely got through half a page because I was coughing so loudly and so frequently that nobody could concentrate. The teacher asked if I needed to go see the nurse. I told him I'd be fine and reminded him that he'd said I needed to be on time, so here I was. I could see the realization starting to dawn on his face, but he didn't say anything. This continued for the next few lessons. I come straight from physical education, arrive on time, and then spend the entire lesson having a coughing fit. The other students were getting annoyed because we couldn't make any progress with our reading. The teacher was getting increasingly frustrated because he couldn't teach properly with me coughing every 30 seconds. After about the fourth lesson of this, he pulled me aside again. He told me that if I needed to be a few minutes late because I was having trouble with my asthma, that would be fine. He said I should just not make it a habit. I asked if he was sure, reminding him that he'd wanted me to be on time. He repeated that I should take whatever time I needed to sort myself out before class. I thanked him and went back to my old routine of taking 10 minutes after physical education to let my breathing settle. Everything went back to normal. The lessons were actually productive again, and I wasn't disrupting everyone with my coughing. But the best bit came a few weeks later on Parent-Teacher Day. My mom came along, and we sat down with my English teacher for our appointment. He started going through my progress in the class, saying I was doing well overall. Then my mom brought up the confusion about my asthma from earlier in the term. The teacher's face went white. He admitted there had been a small misunderstanding but said we'd sorted it out now. My mom didn't let him off that easily. She pointed out that he'd accused her 14-year-old son of smoking. She said he'd ignored my medical condition and refused to believe me when I'd shown him my inhaler. She asked if he had any idea how dangerous it was to force someone with asthma to not manage their condition properly. The teacher apologized and explained that some students had suggested I was smoking and he'd made an incorrect assumption. My mom wasn't done. She said he'd made an incorrect assumption that could have seriously harmed my health. She told him that she'd just recently quit smoking herself, and it had taken months of support from her family, including me. She said the idea that I would start smoking after watching her struggle to quit was absolutely insulting. The teacher was completely silent. He couldn't even look her in the eye. My mom told him she expected better judgment from someone who was supposed to be educating children. She said if he ever doubted my medical needs again, she expected him to contact her or ask for proper documentation rather than making wild accusations based on a joke some teenagers made. The teacher agreed and apologized again. We left the meeting and I caught a glimpse of his face when we walked away. He looked absolutely mortified. My mom had been smoke-free for about 8 months at that point, and she was still dealing with cravings and stress from quitting. Getting accused of encouraging her son to smoke after everything she'd been through had absolutely set her off. After that evening, the teacher never questioned my late arrivals again. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.